While my daughter was lying in intensive care, her husband was out on a yacht, laughing like nothing had happened. An hour later, everything changed. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I never imagined that the quiet hum of hospital machines could sound louder than the chaos of an ocean storm. But that night, as I sat by my daughter's bed in the intensive care unit, every beep felt like a thunderclap inside my skull. Her chest rose and fell in shallow waves, fragile, mechanical. The fluorescent lights washed her pale skin into something ghost-like, as though life itself was retreating, leaving her to fight alone. I had been there for hours, days, really, though time was blurred into one long stretch of waiting. My hand rested on hers, cold against cold, and all I could do was whisper promises into the void. I'm here, I won't leave you, just fight. Outside the room, doctors moved quickly. Nurses spoke in clipped tones, and families passed through hallways with red-rimmed eyes. Life was reduced to a corridor of grief, each door hiding its own private catastrophe. My catastrophe had a name, Emma, my daughter, my child, and I sat with her, carrying memories like a Schildermar in pigtails holding a skipping rope. Emma on graduation day, clutching her diploma. Emma on her wedding day, smiling at a man I had reluctantly learned to call my son-in-law, a man named Daniel. Daniel was not there. He had not come to the hospital when Emma was first rushed in. He hadn't called me. He hadn't asked the doctors. He hadn't held her hand. Hours bled into each other, and finally, through whispers traded in the family waiting area, I learned where he was. A friend of his, too drunk, too careless to know what words should be kept private, laughed as he told someone on the phone Daniel was on a yacht. A yacht, drinking, laughing, surrounded by music and strangers, while his wife lay under machines, clinging to whatever thread of life she still had left. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My chest burned with something colder than grief, something heavier than rage. It was betrayal, but not just of Emma. It was betrayal of everything I had sacrificed to hold this family together. Daniel's absence was not mere neglect. It was abandonment dressed in expensive clothes. And in that moment, I knew what silence felt like when it turned sharp enough to cut. I did not tell Emma what I had learned. Her fight was against her body, not against the truth of her husband's absence. But inside me, something shifted. Something broke. I sat through that night, replaying images in my head. The first time Daniel had come to our house, all charm and false humility. He'd shaken my hand too firmly, the way insecure men often do when they need to prove themselves. He'd told me he would take care of Emma. He promised me she'd never want for anything. And foolishly, like a father who wanted to believe his daughter was safe, I gave him my trust. I gave them both more than trust. I gave them both more than trusting, my resources, my home when they needed it. I had been the silent foundation beneath their glittering facade of happiness. Now, sitting in that cold hospital room, I realized foundations are never thanked. They are stepped on. They are ignored. Until they crumble, the hours stretched into dawn. Nurses came in, changed 4 lines, checked monitors. Emma stirred once, her eyes half open, but she didn't speak. I whispered again, "I'm here, sweetheart. Don't fight alone." My voice cracked, but I held it together because grief is a private thing, and fathers aren't supposed to fall apart. Yet, beneath the weight of the silence, I was already falling apart in places no one could see. When the morning sun finally broke through the narrow hospital windows, painting thin gold lines across the sterile white floors. I stood up and left the room, not because I was giving up on her. No, because I needed to breathe. I needed to walk before the walls swallowed me whole. In the waiting area, Daniel still hadn't appeared. His absence was so loud it mocked me. I sat down, hands folded, and for the first time in my life, I wished for confrontation. I wanted him to appear so I could look him in the eyes and ask, "How could you?" But he didn't. His cowardice was its own answer, and that was the moment that precise second I crossed into silence that was no longer grief. It was calculation. It was steel. I left the hospital not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to let this insult dissolve into thin air. Every betrayal carves its place in memory. This one carved itself into my bones. I walked out of those sliding hospital doors, past the smell of antiseptic, past the vending machines filled with stale candy, past families clinging to each other. I didn't say a word to anyone, not the nurse who asked if I was coming back, not the orderly who held the door open for me. I simply nodded, stepped outside, and felt the cold morning air cut through my lungs like glass. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just got up and walked out of my own life. When I returned from the hospital that morning, the house greeted me with the same stillness it had for decades. It was an old house by anyone else's standards, bricks worn and roof tiles replaced. More times than I cared to count, but to me, it was no less than a cathedral of memory. I stood in the doorway, keys dangling loosely from my hand, and looked at it the way a man might look at a photograph of his own younger self, familiar, cherished, and yet impossibly distant. Every corner of this house bore the weight of sacrifice. The down payment had been made with money I could barely spare, scraped together from years of overtime shifts, cut vacations, and postponed dreams. I built its walls, not only with dollars, but with hours of my life I could never reclaim. Every nail driven in, every crack patched, every brush of paint rolled across these walls had carried one intention: to give my family a place where laughter could live without fear of eviction, where holidays could carry the scent of roasted meals instead of overdue bills. And oh, how it had once lived. The dining room table was still there. Polished oak, scarred with knife marks from years of hurried cutting. Homework scratches from nights when Emma and her brother bent over there. Books under the yellow glow of the chandelier. I could still hear it the way forks clattered against plates. The burst of laughter when someone told a clumsy joke. The sound of chairs scraping against tile as children ran to the living room to catch the opening credits of their favorite show. I remembered birthdays here, balloons tied to the banister, Emma's tiny hands clutching a paper crown. I remembered Christmases where the tree leaned slightly because the stand was crooked, but no one cared because the smell of pine filled the house with something that felt holier than any church sermon. I remembered nights when thunder shook the windows, and both children crawled into my bed, trembling until sleep carried them back to safety. This home was not just shelter, it was my legacy, and yet, as I walked through it that morning, it felt hollow in a way that frightened me. The frames on the walls, wedding photos, baby pictures, candid smiles stared at me like ghosts. The clock in the hallway ticked too loudly, reminding me that time itself had survived here, even if love had not. I walked into the kitchen, ran my hand along the counter I had replaced when Emma graduated college. She had wanted to celebrate that night at a restaurant, but I couldn't afford it then. Instead, I cooked. I cooked with everything I had in me. I remember her hugging me in this kitchen, whispering, "Thank you, Dad. This is perfect." I thought that meant she understood. That she knew what this house, what I had given her. But memory can be a liar. As the years passed, this house stopped being a sanctuary in their eyes. To Daniel, it was just a building, a place to park his car while he chased larger dreams. He mocked the creaking floors, the old fixtures, the sagging porch that I had built with my own 2 hands. "We need something modern," he once told Emma, as if history could be exchanged for granite countertops. And slowly, I saw Emma's gaze shift to my daughter, once content to sit with me in the den and listen to old records, began to imagine futures far from here, as if leaving would make her life shinier, easier, more like his. Still, I held on. I kept the doors open, the lights on, the beds ready. When they needed help with rent, I let them move back in. When they struggled to pay for their first house, I co-signed the loan. When they hosted friends, it was this house. That bore the noise, the spills, the careless laughter that left stains deeper than wine on the carpet. I didn't complain. Fathers don't complain. They absorb. They endure. But that morning, standing in my living room after leaving Emma in intensive care, I saw it all differently. The cracks in the paint looked like veins running through tired skin. The couch where Emma once curled up with a blanket seemed abandoned, its cushions sunken, as though waiting for someone who would never return. Even the smell of the housewood, dust, faint traces of last night's coffee, felt like the scent of a memory left too long in a box. I sat down in my chair by the window, the one spot in the house that had always been mine. From there, I had watched Emma run across the yard, with sparklers on the 4th of July. From there, I had seen her leave for her first prom, dressed in blue, cheeks glowing with nerves. From there, I had watched her drive away on her wedding day, cans tied to the back of a car that promised forever. I thought I had built this house to last longer than me, to be proof of my love even when my voice was gone. But sitting there, in the silence, I realized houses do not keep love alive, people do. And the people I had built this for had already walked away. Even before Daniel chose his yacht over his wife's hospital bed, the air inside felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were mourning. I closed my eyes, pressed my palm against the armrest, and let a long breath escape me. In that moment, I understood something cruel. A home is not indestructible. It can be broken not by storms, but by neglect, by ingratitude, by betrayal. It used to be filled with love. Now it echoed with silence. I used to believe money was just paper, numbers on a page, a tool to move through life. But when you are a parent, money becomes something else entirely. It becomes hours you never see again, nights you work when you should be sleeping, choices you give up so your children can have better ones. Every dollar I ever earned seemed to have their names written on it in invisible ink, as if my hands were never really my own but always reaching for their future. When Emma was accepted into college, I remember the letter arriving on a crisp autumn morning. She tore it open on the porch, her breath fogging in the cool air, her eyes scanning the words before she let out a scream of joy that could have woken the dead. She leaped into my arms, hugging me so tightly I could feel her heartbeat. "I did it, Dad. I really did it." I told her I never doubted her. But inside, a shadow formed, because I knew the cost waiting behind that acceptance letter. Still, I never let her see it. Instead, I went to the bank, withdrew from my savings, and signed the loan papers with hands that trembled only once, when the clerk slid them across the desk. I signed my name beneath hers, tying my future to hers with ink that felt heavier than chains. I worked weekends. I sold the truck I loved. I cut corners so sharp they nearly bled. And on the day she graduated, standing there in her cap and gown, diploma clutched against her chest, she whispered in my ear, "We'll always be there for you, Dad. Always." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket. I believed her, foolishly. I believed. When she married Daniel, I paid again. Not because they asked, but because I wanted her day to be perfect. I covered the flowers, the photographer, the band that played too loudly in the reception hall. I remember standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching her twirl under the lights, her smile brighter than the chandeliers above. She came to me at one point, breathless, cheeks flushed, and said, "I hope I can make you proud, Dad. You've given me everything." I told her she already had. I didn't mention the check I had written that morning, the one that emptied a savings account I had been building for retirement. Pride, after all, does not calculate interest. Later, when they wanted their first house, the bank called me again. This time, it was Daniel's voice that asked, "Just until we get on our feet," he said. "You know how it is, sir." He called me sir as if respect could soften manipulation. I agreed, because Emma's voice came next, softer, pleading, reminding me of the girl who once begged me to push her higher on the swing. I co-signed their mortgage. I watched them pose in front of the house with keys in hand, Daniel's arm wrapped possessively around her waist. They looked like the future I had worked for. I took the photo for them myself, framing it carefully so the house stood tall in the background. That night, I sat alone in my own kitchen, bills spread out like confessions, and whispered to the empty room, "It's worth it. It has to be worth it." But worth is a tricky word. Worth changes shape when gratitude evaporates. There were smaller things, 2 loans that were never repaid, credit cards that quietly filled, vacations for Emma's health that somehow ended up on my account. I kept every receipt, not because I planned to use them, but because they felt like proof that my love had substance. Each line item was a story: tuition payment, photography deposit, mortgage approval. Together, they formed a ledger of devotion. And yet, devotion is not always reciprocated. I still remember the night they told me to leave my own house. It wasn't said with shouting. It was quieter than that, sharper. I had questioned Daniel about a missed payment, something that had arrived in the mail addressed to me because my name was still on the loan. He bristled, his voice slick with arrogance. "Maybe it's time you stopped meddling." Emma didn't defend me. She just looked down at the floor, silent, complicit in her husband's words. Finally, she said it in a voice so small it barely carried. "Dad, maybe you should give us space." Space, that was the word they used, as though I was suffocating them with my presence in the very house I had built with the sweat of my back, the blood of my hours, the marrow of my years. They forgot the truck I sold, the weekends I missed, the promises I kept. They forgot the whispered vows of always at graduations, the hugs at weddings, the tears of gratitude when I wrote checks I could not afford. I walked out of the room that night with the taste of metal in my mouth, like biting down on a coin. Their words clanged against every sacrifice I had ever made. I sat in my chair by the window and stared at the yard, wondering if they even remembered the way I used to mow it every Sunday, rain or shine, so they would never step barefoot onto unkempt grass. The cruelest betrayal is not theft of money, is theft of memory. It is when people take your sacrifice and reframe it as obligation, when they erase the story you wrote with your own hands and replace it with their narrative of entitlement. I had thought love was an investment that would mature over time, that one day I would sit in peace knowing my children were strong because I had carried the weight for them. Instead, I realized I had invested in shadows, and shadows do not repay. Shadows vanish. I looked at the receipts one night, spread across the kitchen table, lit only by the weak glow of a lamp. Each one was like a headstone, marking something I had given up. A vacation I never took. A retirement I never planned. Life I never lived. I touched the papers gently, as if they were fragile relics of a religion I no longer believed in. And that was when it struck me, sharp as lightning cutting through the night. They didn't just forget me. They erased the debt I paid with love. The silence of my house had become unbearable, so I carried my questions to the only place that could give answers, the bank. I walked in with the same heavy steps I'd taken decades earlier when I first signed Emma's tuition loans. Back then, I had entered with hope, with purpose. Now I entered with suspicion pressing down on my shoulders like a second spine. The banker, a young man in a sharp suit, smiled too brightly when he saw me. His nameplate read Stephen. He spoke quickly, as though efficiency could disguise discomfort. "What can I do for you today, Mr. Turner?" he asked. I slid a folder across the desk, filled with letters and statements that had arrived at my house in recent weeks. Unfamiliar balances, overdue notices, accounts I had never opened myself. "I need you to explain this," I said simply. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years. Stephen flipped through the papers, his expression tightening with every page. "Some of these accounts are joint," he said carefully, "and some appear to be co-signed by you. Mortgages, lines of credit, a vehicle loan. I never bought a car." I interrupted. He nodded nervously. "Not for you, but your signature is here." He turned the page, pointing at the bottom. And there it was, my name, written in the same familiar hand I had used on birthday cards and legal documents for decades. Except this time, I didn't remember writing it. My stomach sank. "Show me everything," I demanded. He hesitated, but finally pulled up the accounts. As he clicked through the computer screen, numbers appeared like wounds torn open. Tens of thousands in unpaid balances, default notices hidden in legal jargon, mortgage payments behind by months, and worse still, each one tied back to me. I walked out of that bank with a stack of printouts, so thick it felt like carrying the weight of betrayal in paper form. The numbers screamed louder than words. They had used my trust as collateral. They had leaned on my name like a ladder, climbing toward comforts they could never afford, and left me to carry the fall. The next day, I made an appointment with my lawyer, an old friend named Harris, who had handled my affairs for decades. His office smelled of leather and old books, the kind of place where truth could not hide. He read through the documents slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. Finally, he set them down and looked at me with pity. "They've been reckless, Tom," he said. "This isn't just overspending. This is financial manipulation. They've opened accounts using your co-signature. They've taken loans under your guarantee. Legally, you're tied to every one of these debts." I swallowed the bitterness in my throat, even if I never saw the money, especially then. He replied, "Your signature is on the agreements. That's all the law needs." I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling lined with wooden beams. Memories flickered like ghosts. Emma's graduation, her whispered promise of will, always be there for you, Dad. Daniel's voice at the wedding reception, thanking me for everything, as if gratitude could erase obligation. They had used those moments of trust as camouflage for their greed. How bad is it? I asked. Harris sighed. Their mortgage is months behind. Credit cards maxed out. One of the businesses Daniel started is bankrupt, filed quietly last year. You're listed as guarantor. If the creditors come calling, they won't go to him first. They'll come to you. For a long moment, I said nothing. The air in the office felt heavy, pressing against my ribs. I thought of Emma in the hospital bed, machines keeping her alive, while Daniel laughed on a yacht. And now his debts, his failures, shackled to me like a chain I hadn't realized I was dragging. Finally, I asked, can I fight it? Some of it, yes. Fraud can be argued. But co-signed loans, mortgages, those are ironclad. You're responsible unless they pay. I left Harris's office with a new kind of silence inside me. Not the silence of grief, not the silence of disappointment. This was the silence of realization, the quiet clarity that comes when the fog lifts and you finally see the battlefield beneath your feet. That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table. Receipts from the past, contracts I barely remembered signing, letters written in the cold, impersonal tone of creditors. It looked less like paperwork and more like a crime scene, evidence of how love had been weaponized against me. I traced my finger along the numbers. Mortgage, delinquent. Business loan, defaulted. Vehicle loan, unpaid. Each line item was another betrayal, another cut. But beneath the sting, I felt something awakening. A part of me that had once been sharp, disciplined, unyielding. I had not lived my life as a fool, though they thought me one. Before I was a father, before I was the quiet man who built this home brick by brick, I had been something else, a strategist. A man who had spent years balancing ledgers, understanding systems, knowing how to find weakness and how to use it. Somewhere along the way, I had laid those weapons down, believing family required only love. But now, staring at the evidence of their deception, I realized those skills had not vanished. They had only been waiting. They thought I was grieving. They forgot I was trained for this. I had spent too long believing that fatherhood required only tenderness, that sacrifice alone could protect the people I loved. But I had not forgotten who I was before life reduced me to a man patching roofs and writing tuition checks. I had once been a banker, the kind of man who could look at a column of numbers and see a story, a future, or a trap. Numbers never lied. People did, and as I stared at the mountain of debt Daniel and Emma had tethered to me, I realized it was time to stop being only their father. It was time to become the man I had been trained to be. The next morning, I ironed a shirt I hadn't worn in years, polished my shoes until they reflected a sharpness I felt returning inside me. I walked back into the bank, not as a desperate parent clutching overdue notices, but as a man who knew the language of finance better than the young clerks behind their computers. I asked for detailed statements, credit reports, the entire history of every account connected to my name. When they hesitated, citing policy, I leaned in and recited the exact clause of consumer rights law that entitled me to those documents. The hesitation vanished. Papers slid across the counter. Printers WHIR, red dot. By the time I left, I carried 2 thick binders of information. The weight in my hands was heavy, yes, but familiar. It felt like armor. That afternoon, I called Harris again. This time, My voice had lost the tremor of betrayal. It was calm, surgical. I want every contract reviewed, I told him. Every co-signature, every loan, every agreement. I want to know where the cracks are. He agreed, though I caught a flicker of surprise in his tone. Perhaps he had expected me to collapse under the burden, to retreat into grief like so many other men of my age. But Harris had known me long enough to recognize the difference in my silence now. This was not resignation. This was strategy. While he worked through the legal angles, I widened my net. I contacted an old colleague from my banking days, a man named Fletcher who had moved into risk management. Over coffee in a dim cafe, I laid out the situation. He listened, his pen scribbling notes on a napkin, the same way he used to when we worked late nights calculating risk exposure. They buried themselves, Fletcher said finally, sliding the napkin back to me. And they tried to bury you with them, but there are tools, leverage points. Debt doesn't vanish, it transfers. If you're smart, you can make sure it transfers back. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Not a warm smile, a sharp one. Then that's what I'll do. In the days that followed, I built a fortress of documentation. I organized the binders with military precision color-coded tabs, annotated margins, timelines that connected every reckless decision they had made. I requested credit bureau audits, property records, bankruptcy filings. Each envelope that arrived in the mail was opened with the patience of a surgeon, dissected, catalogued, and slotted into place. Slowly, the picture sharpened. Daniel was not just careless, he was cunning in his own sloppy way. He had hidden defaults beneath new loans, masked insolvency with short-term credit, shifted balances from one account to another like a man rearranging furniture in a burning house. But what he did not account for was my memory. I remembered every check I had written, every promise Emma had whispered, every detail of the loans I co-signed. When numbers didn't match, I saw it instantly. When dates overlapped, I understood what had been concealed. Piece by piece, I began to untangle their web, not to rescue them, but to prepare the rope that would tighten around them at night. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows. To anyone else, it might have looked like the study of a man losing himself to obsession, but to me, it was clarity. I wasn't lost. I was found. For the first time since Emma's hospitalization, I felt steady. Purpose is a salve, more powerful than comfort. Harris called after a week of review. Tom, I've gone through everything. Some of these loans you're trapped in, yes, but others they've crossed into fraud. Falsified income statements, forged documents. That opens doors. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Then keep those doors open. Don't close a single one. Another day, I met with an accountant, a forensic specialist who used to investigate corporate embezzlement. She combed through the binders with sharp eyes, circling figures, highlighting inconsistencies. They covered their tracks poorly, she said. He's arrogant. Arrogance always leaves trails. Exactly, arrogance was Daniel's signature more than my forged one ever was. Piece by piece, I built not just a case, but a weapon. Legal records, financial statements, proof of manipulation. It all came together in a structure so precise, it reminded me of the chessboards I used to keep in my office. Each document was a piece. The mortgage, a rook cornering him slowly. The bankruptcy, a bishop striking from a diagonal he hadn't seen coming. The forged signatures, my queen moving across the board, inevitable and final. They thought I had forgotten how to play. They thought I was a tired old man drowning in grief, but they were mistaken. I wasn't just playing the game, I was rewriting it. By the end of the month, I had everything I needed, a binder of evidence that could destroy them in court, financially, and reputationally, but I didn't rush. Revenge is not served hot. It is served cold, calculated, and plated with precision. I wasn't after an explosion. I wanted silence. I wanted inevitability. As I closed the binder one night, my hand resting on the cover, I whispered into the empty kitchen, "You don't play chess with someone who invented the board." The first cracks showed themselves quietly, almost timidly, as if life itself was testing how much they could endure before breaking. It began with the small things, an application for a new line of credit denied. I knew because the letter came to my address, the bank still linking my name to theirs. The envelope was thin, the kind that carries disappointment in its very weight. I held it for a long moment, then set it aside without opening it further. They would already know the contents. "We regret to inform you." That kind of language burns even when expected. Soon after came the calls. Collection agencies dialing at hours when the sun had not yet risen. I heard Emma's voice on the answering machine once when she visited, trying to explain to them that it was a mistake, that payments were coming soon. Her tone was thin, fraying at the edges. I didn't step in. I just sat in my chair, listening to her voice echo into the room after she had left. A ghost carried on the wires. Daniel's business ventures began to unravel next. He had always fancied himself an entrepreneur, a man destined to own instead of serve. Restaurants, investment schemes, online ventures that promised quick returns, he touched them all with the greed of a gambler, never understanding that money obeys rules, even if men refuse to. I read about one of his companies in the paper. Local bistro shutters after 6 months. The headline was small, buried beneath larger news, but to me it gleamed like a monument. Failure never looks like fire. It looks like lights switched off, doors locked. A for lease sign taped crookedly to the glass dot. Public arguments followed. I heard about them from neighbors, whispers passed in grocery store aisles. Emma and Daniel yelling outside their house, voices sharp enough to carry down the street. One said she had seen Emma throw a glass, shattering it against the wall, while Daniel shouted about money, always money. Love, once so loud, was being drowned out by the roar of debt. Their car broke down next. I saw it one afternoon when I drove past their house, a sleek vehicle Daniel had once boasted about. Hood propped open, smoke curling out like a signal of surrender. He stood in the driveway cursing, phone pressed to his ear, while Emma sat on the porch steps, her face buried in her hands. I did not stop. I drove by slowly, my eyes catching every detail, every crack in the image they had once tried to project. They had chosen appearances over substance. Now, even appearances betrayed them. The foreclosure letter arrived weeks later. This one I opened. Thick envelope, embossed with the cold authority of the bank. I read it slowly, savoring each sterile word. Delinquent payments. Notice of default. Foreclosure proceedings may commence. The language of collapse, written in black and white. I imagined Daniel's face when he opened his copy, the bravado draining from him as reality carved its truth. Houses don't fall with fire, they fall with paperwork. I never interfered. I never called, never offered solutions, never reminded them of what I was quietly holding in my binders at home. I didn't need to act. Life itself was acting on my behalf, stripping away the layers of arrogance, exposing the hollow core. At night, I would sit by my window and think of it all. The silence of my house no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like theatre seating, a private box in which I could watch the unraveling of a play I hadn't written, but had certainly financed. Their downfall was not fast. It was slow, methodical, inevitable. And there was a beauty in that slowness. The way drought works, it will not in a day, but in seasons. Grass browns, leaves curl, rivers shrink, until one day you realize the earth has cracked open and nothing will grow again. That was them. That was their marriage, their finances, their illusion of control. I saw Emma once during this time, outside the grocery store. She looked tired, her eyes ringed with shadows that no amount of makeup could hide. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a smile born of habit, not joy. She asked how I was doing, and I answered simply, fine. She hesitated, as if waiting for me to offer something more, for me to rescue her with comfort or money the way I always had. But I didn't. I let the silence answer for me. She shifted awkwardly, then said goodbye. Watching her walk away felt like watching someone carry water in cupped hands, every drop spilling before she reached her destination. Daniel, I heard, was drinking more. Friends told me they had seen him at bars, loud at first, then quiet in corners, the way men look when they realize their kingdom is sand. His laughter had turned brittle, like glass about to break, and Emma, caught in the undertow of his failures, was sinking too. I did not gloat. That is not my nature. But I observed, and in my observations, I found something resembling peace. There is a satisfaction in seeing truth assert itself. Lies can run fast, but debt, both financial and moral, walks them down. I wrote in my journal one evening, words that came to me as naturally as breath. They thought I was the rain. I was the drought. They came back not with pride, but with the kind of desperation that scrapes the dignity from a person's voice. It was late in the evening when I heard the knock on my door, tentative at first, then sharper, as if they feared I would pretend not to be home. When I opened it, Emma stood there with Daniel half a step behind her. She looked smaller somehow, her frame bent under the weight of exhaustion. Daniel's suit was wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes darting. Like a man rehearsing lies he no longer believed. Dad. Emma's voice cracked on the word. It had been months since she had called me that. She stepped forward, almost reaching for my hand, then stopped. Can we come in? I didn't answer. I simply stepped aside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had once held birthday cakes and holiday dinners. Now it bore only silence. Emma folded her hands tightly, her knuckles white, while Daniel tried to straighten his tie, as though neatness could disguise ruin. We're in trouble, Emma said finally, her voice trembling. The bank, they're taking the house. Daniel's business, it's gone. We don't have anything left. We didn't know where else to turn. Daniel leaned forward, his voice smoother but hollow. Sir, you know I've always respected you. I made mistakes, I'll admit it. But Emma, she doesn't deserve this. We just need a little help. Just enough to get back on our feet. I said nothing. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Do you remember when I was little, and you carried me into this house after I fell asleep in the car? You always said this was my home. Please, Dad, don't let us lose everything. Don't let me lose what you built. Her words twisted the knife in ways numbers never could. Memories offered as currency, her childhood dragged out like collateral. Daniel tried a different angle. Think about Emma's mother, he said softly. What would she want? She'd want you to protect your daughter, to help us through this. We're family. At that, Emma nodded fiercely, clutching her husband's arm as though the performance required both of them. We're family, she repeated. The silence in the room thickened. They waited for me to break it, to fill it with promises, with the old reflex of sacrifice they had always depended on. But I didn't. Emma's tears spilled. Please, just a loan. Just something. We'll pay you back, I swear. We'll make it right this time. Her voice collapsed into sobs, her head bowed. Daniel shifted uneasily, his bravado slipping. His tone sharpened, more desperate than persuasive now. If you don't help us, we'll lose everything. Is that what you want? To see your own daughter homeless? Still, I said nothing. I let the silence do what words never could. Emma's sobs filled the room. Daniel's jaw tightened, his mask crumbling. He looked at me then, truly looked, and for the first time I saw fear not of debt collectors, not of banks, but of me. Of the man they thought was gone. Finally, Emma whispered through her tears, "Why won't you say anything?" I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. I looked at them, the daughter I had raised, the man she had chosen, and I felt the last thread between us snap. My voice, when it came, was quiet, steady, cold as steel. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their creditor. They came back again 3 nights later. This time, they did not knock with hope, they knocked with dread. I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. They followed me into the kitchen, the same place where they had begged before. Only this time, the table was not bare. On it lay a binder, thick, neat, every page marked with tabs and dates. I sat down slowly, gesturing to the chairs across from me. They obeyed, almost cautiously, like children waiting for punishment they already knew was deserved. Emma's voice was the first to break the silence. "Dad, please, we don't have time." The foreclosure, I raised a hand, quietly, firmly, the kind of gesture that does not invite interruption. Then I opened the binder. "This," I said, turning the first page, "is your mortgage history. Payments missed, extensions requested, late fees accrued. My signature attached to the original loan." I flipped to the next section. "Here, business loan. Filed under Daniel's company. Defaulted after 11 months. Guarantor, me." Another page. Credit lines, vehicles, secondary mortgage. All tied back. All in my name. Daniel's face paled. He leaned forward as though to protest, then froze when I turned another page. Forged documents, copies retrieved from the bank, highlighted in yellow. My signature placed where I had never put it. Emma's hand trembled. She whispered, You found all of this." I didn't answer her question. I simply turned another page. Timeline charts, every loan mapped to dates, every missed payment traced. Arrows showing how one lie bled into another. Each detail laid bare, undeniable, a mirror they could not look away from. Daniel swallowed hard, his arrogance gone. How long? How long have you been?" "Long enough," I said, my voice calm. "Long enough to see every game you thought you were clever enough to play. Long enough to understand that this wasn't carelessness. It was strategy. Yours, and now mine." Emma shook her head, tears brimming. "We didn't mean," I closed the binder sharply. The sound echoed like a gavel. Intentions don't erase debts. The room fell into silence, but it was no longer mine, it was theirs. Their silence now carried the weight, the shame, the collapse. I leaned back, folding my hands. No anger, no shouting, just stillness that made them squirm. For years, I gave, I said. I paid for schools, for weddings, for houses. I signed papers because I trusted you, and you turned that trust into chains. You thought grief would keep me blind. You thought silence meant weakness, but silence is patience, and patience builds its own kind of weapon. Daniel's face crumpled. Emma pressed her hands to her mouth. The binder sat between us like a blade, cutting cleanly through the last illusions. Finally, I let the words fall, soft as a verdict. Let's talk terms. The silence after my words stretched until it seemed the air itself refused to move. Daniel shifted in his chair, his hands restless, as though he could claw his way out of what was now undeniable. Emma stared at the binder, unable to meet my eyes. You want help, I said evenly, but help has terms, not gifts, not charity, terms. Daniel scoffed, though the sound was thin. We're family. You can't put conditions on family. I leaned forward, my gaze fixed on him. Family put conditions on me the moment you forged my name. Now it's my turn. I opened a second folder. Inside were neatly typed documents, each marked with tabs. I slid the first one across the table. A public apology. Written, signed, and delivered to every relative and friend who believed the lies you fed them about me. You will admit what you did. You will name me as the man who carried your debts, and tell them why you're sitting here now. Emma flinched. Dad, please, don't make this public. It'll destroy us. I didn't answer. I slid the next document across. A contract, legal, binding. From this day forward, no loan, no purchase, no signature, without my approval. Every account will pass through my hands. You wanted freedom. You earned chains. Daniel's jaw clenched. You can't control us like that. I turned another page. Therapy, both of you. Financial counseling, mandatory sessions, documented attendance. You will sit across from a professional and confront the rot you've been feeding on, and I will hold those records. Emma's tears fell silently. Daniel slammed his hand against the table. This is humiliation. Yes, I said calmly. It is, because humiliation is the only language arrogance understands. They looked at each other, a silent exchange of panic. Resistance flickered in Daniel's eyes, but I waited. I knew how silence worked. Pressure doesn't break people. Waiting does. Finally, Emma whispered, What if? What if we agree? I reached into the folder and pulled out the final paper. A check already written. I placed it on the table, face down. Then you'll sign everything here. And you'll take this. Enough to keep the bank from your door for now. Daniel's hand twitched toward it, but I covered the check with my palm. Understand this, I said, my voice low. Mercy isn't free. The night they left, the house returned to silence. Not the heavy silence of grief, nor the empty silence of abandonment, but a silence that finally belonged to me. Their footsteps faded down the porch. Their car engine coughed, then disappeared into the distance. I sat at the kitchen table, alone, the binder closed, the checkbook put away. The contracts signed and stacked neatly in their folder. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on my chest. Justice has no sound, only stillness. I rose, slowly, and walked through the house, touching the walls as I went. Every mark, every dent, every faded spot of paint had been earned. This home had stood through storms, through laughter, through betrayal. And now, at last, it had stood through my reckoning. It was no longer a place where debts were hidden. It was a place where truth had been written, line by line, into permanence. In the living room, the photographs waited. Emma's childhood smile, my wife's eyes, gentle even in black and white. I picked up one frame, the one of her holding Emma as a baby in the garden, roses blooming behind them. Her face looked at me as if she already knew the path I would one day walk. I brushed my thumb across the glass. You'd have understood, I whispered. You always did. The house creaked softly, like an old friend breathing beside me. Outside, the night air carried the scent of rain beginning to fall. But inside, I felt dry, steady, unshaken. For years, they had wanted me silent, invisible, gone. Yet now, every step they would take, every decision they would make, carried my signature, my conditions, my control. I returned to my chair by the window, the one that had seen Emma grow, the one that had watched her drive away in her wedding car. I sat there now with no bitterness, only a calm certainty. Betrayal had cut me deep, but it had also sharpened me. They mistook kindness for weakness. They mistook silence for surrender. They were wrong. My hand rested on the photograph in my lap as the words formed inside me, heavy and certain as stone. They wanted me gone. Now they can't move without me. Kindness is not weakness. It's patience, weaponized. Justice wore the scent of roses this year.